we don't have any interruptions in our second debate. And debating in the second slot on the topic, this House would treat nations that provide safe haven to terrorists as terrorist-supporting nations. We're going to hear from Matthias Carthen and Wiley Stem on the affirmative, against Jake Dion and Daniel Marnick on the negative. I'll let the debaters start us off. Please join me in welcoming them.
Good morning. My name is Wiley Stem. The attacks that took place on American soil on September 11, 2001 not only shook the foundation of the American people, it also forced the American government to seriously reconsider its foreign policy. This House would treat nations that provide safe haven to terrorists as terrorist-supporting nations. This is our resolution. And this morning, we, the affirmative, hope to prove to you that implementing this policy is the right choice. We, the affirmative, are going to present two contentions: that terrorism is a real threat, and that the treatment of nations that provide safe haven to terrorists as terrorist-supporting nations is necessary. Let's get right into our first contention, which is that terrorism is a real threat. Here we define terrorism via the Department of State as premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience. On this, we would first like to say that terrorism is wrong. In a 2006 journal article, Professor Andrew Fiala stated, "Terrorism is wrong because it deliberately harms the innocent for the purpose of advancing a political agenda." Fiala goes on to lay out the immorality and sociopathic nature of terrorism, saying that terrorism is wrong because the people killed by terrorists are quite literally viewed as mere means. Since those who justify terrorism are willing to use violence against the innocent, this gives us a reason to be suspicious of their moral character. Furthermore, the United Nations Security Council commented on terrorism as a threat to human rights, saying that terrorism in all forms and manifestation constitutes one of the most serious threats to peace and security. Secondly, we quote the Department of Homeland Security for our second subpoint, and it is that today's terrorists can strike at any place, at any time, and with virtually any weapon. This quote shows the reality of the threat that is terrorism and is not merely a fear tactic. One could point to any one of the many reports on successful or botched acts of terrorism in the past decade, from 9/11 to the shoe bomber Richard Reed, to the 2005 suicide bombings of the London public transport system, to the 2010 Times Square car bombing attempts, to a host of others, too many to name. You may say that the odds are in your favor, and that it will never happen to you, but this kind of thinking will only get you so far, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't do everything in your power to prevent it from happening again. I'll now move on to the second contention, which is that the treatment of nations that provide safe haven to terrorists as terrorist-supporting nations is necessary. This treatment involves not only a more realized military focus, but also a ban on arms-related goods and a restriction of economic assistance. Our first subpoint is that passive and active state support of terrorism exists, and it must be addressed. Professor Farouk Ekmeki said in an essay that ever since the 1970s, nearly every important terrorist group has had some ties to at least one supportive government. We cite both the relationship between bin Laden and Pakistan and that of Iran and Hamas as evidence. Sir Salman Rushdie wrote on bin Laden's holdup in Pakistan, "Are we supposed to believe that Pakistan didn't know he was there, and that the Pakistani intelligence did nothing to facilitate his presence in Abbottabad, and while he ran Al-Qaeda with couriers coming and going for 5 years? Regarding Iran's relationship with Hamas, Professor Ekmeki writes that Iran has financially supported Hamas since the early 1990s. Our second subpoint is that terrorist safe havens help facilitate terrorism. Here we define a safe haven simply as a place of refuge or security. According to the Office of the Coordinator for Counterterrorism, safe havens are the sites of planning and resource management, as well as secure locations for terror leaders that allow them to inspire global acts of terrorism. Last but certainly not least, our final subpoint is that this treatment leads to more effective counterterrorism. Here we define counterterrorism as activities that are intended to prevent terrorist acts or to eradicate terrorist groups. The Department of State tells us that following the attacks of 9/11, discussions with terrorist-supporting nations began with the intention of getting them out of the terrorism business, thereby preventing future acts of terrorism if the countries follow suit. Also, Dick Cheney has illustrated the military effectiveness that was better facilitated by targeting state sponsors of terrorism, saying that in the 20 months since the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. has freed 2 nations from oppression and terror. We destroyed Al-Qaeda's grip on Afghanistan, removed the repressive Taliban regime from power, and nearly half of Al-Qaeda's leadership has been captured or killed. I have just laid out the points of the affirmative. This House will not stand for acts of terrorism, and such acts should not go unchecked. Terrorism harms the innocent, perpetuates fear, and could terminally lead to all-out war and extinction. Putting focus on state sponsors of terrorism gets us one step closer to ridding the world of terror. We hope you choose to vote in favor of security and in favor of the affirmative. Thank you. terrorist is someone that would deliberately harm an innocent person. Deliberately being the key word for advancing some kind of agenda.
Okay, so this person could be any actor, any state, any like individual. What does your definition say about this?
Well, our definition, once again, is that terrorism is premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence others.
Okay, yeah, you say subnational groups. What's the distinction between why a state can't be like a terrorist actor under your definition and not? What's the difference there?
We believe that the difference is the intentions behind the act. A terrorist would deliberately harm an innocent person to advance their agenda.
Okay, and then also you talk about counterterrorism at the end of your speech. What is counterterrorism? Like, how does it stop? Like, what is the method by which it stops terrorism?
Well, counterterrorism are activities that are intended to. Okay, I'm sorry. Activities that are intended to prevent terrorist acts or to eradicate terrorist groups. Thank you.
My name is Jake Dion, and I am the first negative constructor. The negative respectfully requests that this audience rule in favor of the negative in today's debate for two reasons. First, the affirmative's definition of terrorism undermines the ability for the affirmative to be advantageous in any way. Secondly, the securitization of the affirmative promotes violence. In looking to our first contention, the affirmative specifically utilizes a political definition of terrorism. Any definition will be steeped in political bias, as Jonathan White notes when he states that there is no standard definition of terror and each approach of terrorism seems to be based on political biases. This is apparent when you look at both the Bush administration and the Obama administration. Both administrations have spoke about the evil extremists that use violence to advance their political agenda. Isn't that exactly what the United States is doing in the global war on terror, as well as in Pakistan regarding the drone strikes? For the affirmative to win any benefit from their plan, they must prove that they are stopping the bad guys and not serving their own interests. In looking to our second point, contention 2, the securitization of the affirmative promotes violence. The affirmative's paranoid portrayal of terrorism dates back to McCarthyism, where people were told to hunt for the commies. We construct an enemy who represents evil that we must respond to due to identity construction. We do this because they are not us. They are not the democratic, civilized individuals, but the barbaric, irrational, violent ones. Cindy Katz agrees and states, the mechanisms of state-sponsored terrorism are ready to turn on us without warning and without provocation. It is the very banality of the way terrorism is constructed and confronted in the contemporary United States that opens the door to just a little more of this every day. The performance of security in everyday environment conceals both this rotten heart and insecurity it provokes. Next, the way we talk about these people justifies the massive militarization of the United States policy. Furthermore, identity construction through the resolution allows us to put a label on extremists on entire nations when only a small section of the population is only acting irrational. Their insecurity of faceless enemy provokes the banalization of fear and terror, which makes violence inevitable in the name of peace and security. Katz further agrees and states, this opens the door to more extremism as a site of permanent vulnerability that reinforces all uneven social relations in the world and makes violence inevitable for peace and security. Katz continues, if as an imperial power the United States can do no better than to instantiate a rapturous capitalism which builds on and reinforces all the uneven social relations of its past, if the social, political, economic, cultural, and environmental struggles of the 20th century had never occurred, the horror is almost beyond comprehension. This horror and our implication in its production can no longer be occluded by the finish of security and the routinization of terrorism. Now I will directly negate the affirmative's two claims. The affirmative states that terrorism is a real threat. First, they state that terrorism is bad because it harms